Welcome to the deep dive. It's easy to get overwhelmed trying to keep up with everything. So what we do here is try to sift through all that noise and pull out what really matters for you. Today, we're digging into the latest twists and turns in the U.S.-China trade relationship. We're looking at a batch of really interesting reports from Chinese media, specifically from Monday, April 14th, 2025. Issue 1224, I think.
That's the one. And we're basically going to unpack these reports to get at a key question for you, the listener. What are the main takeaways here? Regarding these U.S. reciprocal tariffs, China's response, and what it all means for the U.S. and, well, the global economy.
Right. And there are some fascinating angles, like this idea of a Tumu crisis in the U.S. and some maybe surprising insights from figures like Tim Cook at Apple and Ray Dalio.
Yeah, definitely some unexpected stuff in there. The sources we're drawing on include, official statements from China's Ministry of Commerce, the Foreign Ministry, plus media analysis, commentary, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. So our mission really is to cut through it all and give you a clear picture of the current dynamics and where this whole critical economic relationship might be heading. Okay, let's get into it. First up, these U.S. reciprocal tariffs and how China first reacted.
Well, the first thing to note is the timing. On April 12th, that's U.S. Eastern Time, there was this announcement. They were exempting certain products from the tariffs, things like computers, smartphones, semiconductor manufacturing gear, integrated circuits.
Okay, and this wasn't the first move that week, was it?
No, exactly. That's important for you to know. It was actually the second adjustment. They'd already done a deferral just a couple of days before, on the 10th.
So a quick change.
Yeah.
And China's initial reaction, the Commerce Ministry spokesperson, what did they say?
Well, the first word was basically, we're evaluating the impact. Pretty standard, maybe a bit cautious initially.
Right, sort of a wait-and-see approach, maybe trying to figure out if this was a real shift from the U.S. or just something else.
Could be. Not wanting to jump the gun on what might just be a temporary tweak. But that caution didn't last long. It was followed up pretty quickly by a strong condemnation of the tariffs themselves.
Ah, okay. So what was the core argument there?
The Commerce Ministry line was that these tariffs just fly in the face of basic economic laws, right? And that they mess up the whole international economic and trade system.
And not just in theory, I assume. They talk about real-world impact.
Oh, yeah. They specifically mentioned how the tariffs hurt businesses on both sides, mind you, and consumers too. And fundamentally, they argued, it doesn't actually solve any of the problems the U.S. claims it's trying to fix.
Didn't they use some kind of saying? Something about a bell?
They did, yeah. It takes the person who tied the bell to untie it. A pretty clear way of saying, this is on the U.S. to fix.
Right. The responsibility lies with the U.S. side.
Exactly. And their overall stance hasn't really changed. Trade wars are lose-lose. Protectionism doesn't lead anywhere good. They're pushing the U.S. to just scrap these tariffs entirely and get back to talking, but, based on mutual respect.
Okay. Now, zooming out a bit, the overall tone from China seems, pretty firm. There's talk in these reports of this accompany to the end rhetoric. What does that really signal?
Well, if you put it in context,
Yeah.
especially the fact that those really high tariffs, like 50% on some Chinese goods, were still in place despite these exemptions, the Commerce spokesperson's reaction becomes clearer.
How so?
They apparently described the whole situation, these continued high tariffs, as basically a meaningless numbers game. And more than that, something that signifies a severing of economic ties. Strong words.
Wow, okay. Severing ties.
Yeah.
That definitely sounds serious. And I guess that helps explain why we didn't see that phone call, the one Trump apparently expected from China.
It certainly fits. Yeah, it sounds like China just wasn't willing to pick up the phone under those circumstances. What did the report say about why no call came?
Well, the interpretation seems to be that China saw it as engaging under duress, which they weren't prepared to do. The feeling was, the U.S. needs to change its tune first.
And the Foreign Ministry's office in Hong Kong. They were even blunter, weren't they?
They really were. They directly addressed the U.S. claim about waiting for a call and basically accused the U.S. of being obsessed with bullying and extorting. They flat out warned China won't be calling to surrender.
Oof. Okay, so no mincing words there.
Not at all. They even brought up Xi Jinping's earlier comments to Trump, about win-win being the core of the relationship, and sort of lamented that the U.S. hadn't listened. The diplomatic climate sounds frosty.
Yeah, frosty is a good word. And adding fuel to that fire was the Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Lin Jian. His reaction to Vice President Vance's comments about borrowing from Chinese peasants.
What did he say?
He called the remarks ignorant and impolite. and apparently reinforced that barbarians label that have been floating around. So for you, the listener, the language being used here is really quite stark. It shows just how deep the disagreement runs.
So the big picture takeaway from these reports seems to be that Trump's, let's call it, extortion strategy with the tariffs didn't work out as planned.
That's the assessment, yes. In fact, the suggestion is it backfired, making relations worse and maybe even stirring up problems inside the U.S.
Which brings us to this really interesting analogy. They're using the Tunu crisis. Can you explain that a bit? What's the connection they're drawing?
Sure. The Tumu crisis refers to a specific event in Ming Dynasty history, a big military defeat that happened largely because of internal problems, bad leadership, poor strategy within the Chinese court itself.
Okay.
So the analogy suggests that maybe the Trump camp, or the U.S. more broadly, is facing its own internal crisis, its own potential Tumu moment, driven by internal issues and miscalculations rather than just external pressure.
And the reports link this to some underlying economic realities in the U.S.
They do, and they bring in some really interesting voices to make that point, like Tim Cook from Apple.
Right. His explanation for why Apple makes so much stuff in China.
Yeah.
It wasn't about cheap labor, was it?
Not at all. He apparently pushed back hard on that idea, saying China hasn't been a low-cost place for a while now. His point was about the sheer concentration and sophistication of the tech ecosystem there and the engineers.
The engineers.
Yeah, he apparently told the story about how in China, you could find enough engineers to fill several football fields for a project, whereas in the U.S., you'd struggle to fill a single room with the right skills.
Wow. That's quite a visual. So the reports are painting this picture of the U.S. having some pretty deep-seated internal challenges that go way beyond just trade policy, making it hard to just, bring all the factories back.
Exactly. It suggests that dream is maybe, well, a dream. And then you have Ray Dalio, the investor, weighing in, too.
What was his take? Similar point.
Similar conclusion, but from a different angle. Dalio apparently focused on the challenges of bringing manufacturing back because of what he described as the low cultural level and poor education in the U.S. workforce.
That sounds harsh. Did he back that up?
He cited a statistic, reportedly, that something like 60% of Americans read below a sixth grade level. His point seemed to be about the overall productivity and skill level needed for modern manufacturing. He even drew a parallel, maybe controversially, to the Qing dynasty trying to keep its people ignorant.
Okay, so you've got a major tech CEO and a major finance guy, both basically saying the U.S. workforce isn't currently equipped for a big manufacturing comeback. Huh. That's quite a statement presented in these reports.
It is. And what's striking is how these two perspectives, one from industrial capital, one from financial capital, seem to converge on this same basic problem: a lack of enough high-quality skilled labor in the U.S.
So if that's the case, what about technology? Could AI be the solution? Does AI fix the labor issue? The reports mention that, right?
They do touch on it. But the sense you get from these reports is that the hope that AI could just easily step in and fill that gap, well, that hope is fading. Especially, they say, with China making strides, mentioning models like DeepSeek plus Huawei.
So the view presented is that China might actually take the lead in AI.
That's the strong suggestion, yeah. And that raises other concerns mentioned in the reports, like military implications. There's even a mention of avoiding a second Opium War scenario if China were to fall behind in AI.
Right, national security implications. But they also mention U.S.-Europe cooperation.
Yeah, a brief note about the U.S. pushing the tech side and the EU handling the legal or regulatory side of AI. But the main thrust seems to be that this idea of AI magically enabling U.S. reindustrialization is looking less likely, especially compared to China's progress.
Okay, so if bringing manufacturing back en masse is viewed as unrealistic, partly due to labor and maybe AI not being a silver bullet, then Trump's big promise, make America great again, bring manufacturing back, starts to look shaky, according to this analysis.
Exactly. The reports suggest it's seen as, well, nonsense was a word used, and that maybe Trump's focus has shifted more towards internal political battles and avoiding blame.
Which loops back to that Tumu crisis idea, doesn't it? This internal vulnerability, fed by these economic weaknesses, is maybe why we're seeing this apparent shift on tariffs.
That's precisely the connection the reports draw. The argument is that his main focus now is internal maneuvering, not that grand vision. And with the tariff war seemingly failing or even backfiring, they point to other warning signs, specifically in the U.S. financial system.
The rising yield on U.S. Treasury bonds. They call that a terrifying signal for Trump. Why is that seen as so significant? For our listeners, what does that practically mean?
Well, rising bond yields often signal decreased confidence in an economy or its currency. It can mean the government has to pay more to borrow money, which makes things like funding initiatives or managing debt harder. So for Trump, it potentially undermines his economic narrative and makes promises harder to keep.
Okay. And the analysis in these reports suggests this isn't just about, say, Japan selling off U.S. debt.
No, they actually downplay that idea. The argument put forward is that China doesn't even need to actively dump U.S. bonds. They use the phrase, just market reactions are sufficient.
Just market reactions?
Yeah.
What are they implying there? What does that actually mean?
It suggests that actors within the U.S. might be driving this. Maybe people aligned with Biden, maybe Wall Street folks unhappy with the tariffs, maybe even some factions within Trump's own circle. There are even whispers, according to the reports, of some in the financial markets either passively letting it happen, fanning the flames, or even actively taking advantage of the situation.
So this internal pressure cooker, this Tumu crisis getting worse, could be a major reason for the sudden backtrack on tariffs.
That's the strong implication, yes. A key factor pushing Trump to change course. Which brings us back to that specific backdown on the tariffs. The U.S. did announce exemptions, but the messaging was all over the place, wasn't it?
Yeah, it seemed quite messy. The Chinese Commerce Ministry acknowledged it, but how did they frame it?
They called it a small step in the right direction. Correcting a wrong practice. Acknowledging it happened, but maybe not giving it too much credit yet.
But then Trump himself went on social media and said, what? No exemptions.
Pretty much. He denied any exemptions happened, claimed that tariffs were just sort of moved around.
Which sounds confusing. And then Commerce Secretary Lutnick added another layer.
Right. Lutnick apparently said the exemptions were only temporary anyway, and that these products would eventually fall under a special key tariff in a new semiconductor category. It just sounds incredibly convoluted.
Yeah, definitely not clear communication. And the way the announcement itself was handled, late on a weekend, hard to find online, media questions unanswered, it all seems designed to downplay it maybe.
That's how the reports interpret it. Very low-key, almost opaque. But despite all the denials and the confusing messaging, the conclusion drawn in these sources is pretty firm.
Yeah.
The Trump administration did back down on the tariff war. They made a concession.
Okay, so if they did back down, what do these reports suggest were Trump's original motives for the whole tariff war anyway? And what are the bigger strategic implications now?
Well, the analysis suggests the main driver wasn't really about trade deficits or pure economics. It was more about internal U.S. politics, consolidating power, creating an external enemy in China, and using tariffs as leverage, basically to extort concessions and promote an anti-China stance globally.
They give examples of that.
Yeah, the report mentions the really high tariffs slapped on Vietnam, 46%. The interpretation offered is that this wasn't just about Vietnam, but an attempt to force them to pick sides to join an anti-China coalition to help encircle China.
So less economics, more geopolitics, and domestic politics.
That's the picture painted here, yeah. And when that strategy started to backfire, when the tariff war actually hurt Trump's own goals, they had to adjust.
Interesting. And who gets the exemptions? Does that tell us anything?
Well, the reports speculate Vietnam might get some relief, which could indirectly benefit China anyway. Mexico, which is a huge trade partner and re-exports a lot of Chinese goods, apparently was never really the main target of these specific high tariffs.
And the whole dynamic has shifted now, hasn't it? It's not just the U.S. setting the terms for talks anymore.
That's a key point in these reports. The sense is that it's flipped. It's less about Trump wanting to talk and more about China being reluctant to engage unless the fundamental approach changes.
And this isn't just a view from China, right? There's criticism within the U.S. too.
Oh, yeah. The reports definitely mention that. They point to bipartisan criticism figures like former VP Pence, Wall Street types, even Elon Musk expressing concerns about the tariff policy.
So the conclusion is,
Yeah.
what? The U.S. needs to back off the tariff war completely for any meaningful dialogue.
That seems to be the assessment. Stopping the tariff war and easing off on what's seen as extreme strategic pressure is now viewed as basically a prerequisite from the Trump administration side if they want serious talks with China, especially about broader issues like the Western Pacific.
Meanwhile, how is the rest of the world reacting to all this? Are other countries just watching?
Not just watching, it seems. The reports mention the EU's chief negotiator planning a trip to Washington. The goal: to try and convince Trump to lower tariffs on billions of euros worth of EU exports.
So the EU sees an opening, perhaps? Or just continuing pressure?
Possibly both. And at the same time, the EU is also busy trying to sign free trade deals elsewhere. There's a quote mentioned from European Commission President von der Leyen about the EU turning more towards Asia.
Okay, so it sounds like
That's the strong impression, yeah. A global sense that it failed. And there's still this lingering question of when the U.S. will actually publish the full detailed document explaining these convoluted exemptions.
right. And the message seems to be that trying to spin it won't work.
Pretty much. The reports remind Trump that flexibility and denial can't hide a compromise, especially with all the internal U.S. issues mounting up. They even mention that report about a man being charged with threatening Trump.
And other global powers are adjusting their stance based on this U.S.-China dynamic.
It seems so. Comments from von der Leyen again, and also Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, are interpreted in these reports as signals for other countries to kind of pursue their own interests, assuming U.S.-China relations aren't improving anytime soon.
Lavrov said something specific.
Yeah, he apparently made a point of saying that Sino-Russian relations are not something they discuss with the U.S., a clear signal of alignment, perhaps. The reports also briefly touch on potential political trouble for South Korea's leader and reiterate China's main focus for U.S. dialogue, ending the tariff war.
Okay, so looking longer term now, what's the final assessment from China's perspective? Based on these sources, what are the big consequences?
The main conclusion presented is pretty stark. Trump's actions, objectively, have sped up the decline of U.S. global power, especially its financial dominance.
The decline in hegemony.
That's the idea. This perceived weakness, this backing down, is viewed as a historic moment. Economically, the U.S. just isn't seen as the clear number one anymore in these analyses. So for you, our listener, this signals potentially major shifts in global economic power, affecting everything from investments to trade flows long term.
And the view is that China has effectively cornered the U.S. on this.
Yeah.
That there's no real option but to reverse the tariffs significantly.
That's the analysis. Yes, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce has left the Trump administration with little room to maneuver, is the argument. They even use that Tumu crisis analogy again, comparing it to issues at the U.S.-Mexico border customs problems, smuggling drones.
Suggesting internal breakdown or decay.
Sort of. There's even speculation in the reports that Trump and his allies might be willing to set up their own channels, maybe even undermine the U.S. system itself if it gets in their way, drawing parallels to how U.S. policy operates in other regions like the Middle East.
That's a pretty strong claim. What about China's own strategy moving forward?
The report suggests the world can't just snap back to how things were before the tariff war, and China probably doesn't want to. Their focus is described as building minimum economic internal circulation, but also circulation upgrade, strengthening ties through frameworks like ASEAN +1, ASEAN +3, RCP, the Belt and Road Initiative.
Essentially building an alternative system.
That's the implication. Almost like a WTO version 2.0, but potentially without the U.S. at the center.
Yeah.
And the international community. The report suggests everyone's kind of prepared for the U.S. to drag its feet on fully rolling back the tariffs.
But there's an if.
There is a conditional ending. If Trump completely backs down on the tariffs, then China would respond in kind, removing its own retaliatory tariffs. They use the phrase, help those who want to cross the river, a potential off-ramp, but only after a full U.S. reversal.
Fascinating. Okay, so just to quickly recap the key insights for you listening, this deep dive into Chinese media reports from April 2025 paints a picture of failed U.S. reciprocal tariffs, a really resolute stance from China, significant economic headwinds facing the U.S. internally, signs of worry about the U.S. financial system stability, and a definite, if somewhat obscured, retreat by the Trump administration on the tariff war. All of this points towards a potentially shifting global economic order.
Yeah, and that leaves us with a pretty big question for you to think about, really. Considering everything we've just discussed, what are the genuine long-term consequences here? Not just for the U.S. and China, but for global trade overall. And what does this mean for America's future role in the international economy? It's something to really mull over beyond the day-to-day headlines.
Definitely food for thought. And remember, this has been a snapshot based on these specific reports from that time. Things are almost certainly going to keep evolving. So stay tuned for future deep dives as this story continues to unfold.